Thanks very much for inviting me, and what's been nice is I'm staying with Michelle Thompson, who obviously was my colleague, and as she said when we came in, we've been violently agreeing with each other on politics for the last hour and a half and are likely to continue to do so, probably till well after midnight, I would imagine. Now, obviously I became active in 2014, and I became active because a leaflet came out in January 14 saying that if we voted yes and left the UK, we would leave the UK NHS and Scotland would have no NHS at all. And I just laughed and threw it in the bin. But when I went to work in the hospital, I realised that there were nurses who were saying, I'd love Scotland to be independent. But in actual fact, I have to vote no, because I have to vote no for the NHS. And that just did my dinger. So it's their own fault that I got up on my hind legs and started touring around. And my hubby, who's parked at the back, and I did 5,500 miles in 2014 all over Scotland, and we're already doing it again. So make sure you put the car in for a service in 17 days. It says it's due. Because we are again at a major crossroads, and it's really important that we take the time to decide what our future is. Because we didn't vote for Brexit. Scotland voted 62% to remain. And if we had another vote here in Scotland right now, it would be even stronger. And when people talk about, oh, we should have a people's vote, we should support a people's vote, what would they put to the public? If it's the same bloomin' Hobson's choice that we're going to get as MPs, crap deal versus no deal, what's the point in putting that to the public? You might notice all the scaremongering that we've had over the summer. Now, what they're talking about, problems maybe getting food, problems getting drugs, these things are true if it's a no deal. But it's very weird for a government to be talking like that, for a government to be trying to frighten their own people. The job of a government is to pat us on the head and say, it'll all be fine. So why are they doing that? It's because they're trying to make it socially unacceptable for any MP to vote against the deal, no matter how bad the deal is. So what's the point in putting that to the public, unless there is an option to not go over the cliff? Because the problem that we have at the moment is the public are bored out of their skulls with Brexit. People see it on the news and they're turning off. And people are not recognising that it's going to apply to them. Well, I don't run a business. Or I run a business, but it's a wee business. Or I run a business and I don't import or export. So Brexit will have no impact on me. Despite the fact that all the prices we're paying for our food or what we're buying in the supermarket have already gone up since Brexit. People are thinking it won't apply to me. And the problem is because what you're hearing on the news is only talking about customs and trade and tariffs. And people are thinking that's what Brexit is. It's some technical thing that'll happen down in Dover and it won't affect me. But it will. It's actually going to affect everybody. And that's because the EU is about so much more than trade. The EU has been about 28 countries in the end, working together, muddling through, coming up with compromises as they face some of the biggest challenges we face, whether it's cybersecurity, terrorism, climate change, migration from war zones. All of those things are not things you can sort just as one country. And the problem is it's this coming out of collaboration. And the impact for us on health and on healthcare is significant. Now, the first one that you would notice is workforce. Workforce is a challenge for all 4 UK health services. In actual fact, the biggest challenge is in England. They have over 40,000 nurse vacancies. Over 1 in 10 nursing posts in England are empty. That is 2.5 times our rate. And if you speak to a nurse in Scotland, they'll tell you how hard pressed they are. Imagine that being 2.5 times worse. And yet they're doing everything they can to drive people away and make the UK an unwelcoming place for people who come from outside. So what we have seen is we have seen a 90% drop, 90% drop in EU nurses coming to the UK. i.e., that has just dried up since the Brexit vote. In Scotland, even though we are trying to send out the message, you are welcome, we want you here, we value you, 14% of our EU doctors are already in the process of leaving. These are the people that look after you. This nonsense story about because of immigrants you can't see a doctor or you can't get help. In actual fact, the people who come to settle in the UK are usually younger, fitter. They usually come here to work. So in actual fact, there was a bigger chance that the person you were queuing to see was from somewhere else. My husband's perched at the back, 32 years here, working as a GP in our system. He's German. Germany trained him. Germany put him through university. We have done nothing but gain from his expertise for 32 years. But 2 years on, he still doesn't know what his rights will be. 2 years on, there are people who are valuable people here from Europe whose families have been refused citizenship. We've got friends, 2 German GPs in Ayrshire, been there well over 20 years, 3 kids born and grown up in Ayrshire, and they thought, let's get our citizenship for the kids. Eldest and youngest granted, middle child refused. So of course, what are they starting to talk about? Maybe we should go back to Leipzig, where we will be safe. That is how EU nationals feel. They feel really insecure, they feel unwelcome, and they feel distressed. So even though we, hopefully, most people in Scotland are being welcoming and are being genuine, they look at Windrush, they look at how those people were treated, and they look at their kids and think, we're still not secure here. And that's why they're leaving. And the NHS does not run on buildings or hospitals. It's people that make you better. It's people who might use a machine, but the machine ain't working by itself. It's people who operate on you. It's people who care for you. And those are the people that we really need. And that's going to be the first thing that will hit most people who are using any kind of healthcare. And in social care, it's even more dramatic. The staff who come particularly from Eastern Europe and work in social care, looking after our grandparents or our disabled child or our auntie in a care home. And all of these services are struggling to recruit. So workforce is number one. Number two, one of the luxuries that nobody ever sang the praises of, reciprocal healthcare. If you've got any sense, you have a wee plastic card in your wallet, your European health insurance card, so that if you go and you get drunk in Munich at Oktoberfest and you fall down, they'll fix your leg as if you were a local citizen. That's actually amazing. That is an amazing thing, that some other country will fix you as if you were one of their own citizens. And what we also have is for our retired people who want to go and settle in the sunny bits, feeling that they've put their dues in the rain hard enough for 50 years. Actually, they quite fancy a wee bit of sunshine in the south of France. But they've never lived there. They've never paid tax there. And yet through the S1 system, they can transfer their healthcare rights from here to France within the EU. And they get treated as if they were French. That is amazing. And these are things that nobody praised, nobody valued, nobody talked about. And yet we're going to lose them. We also, I asked Theresa May last January 17, about the European Medicines Agency. And by and large, in PMQ, she stood there and opened and closed her mouth like a goldfish. And that just sent an absolute shiver down my spine, because I thought, that means she thinks the EU is only about trade and customs. This is clearly not on her agenda and not on her desk. Now, she's woken up to it now. It's in Chequers. Chequers is just a big cake-and-eat-it shopping list. We're leaving. We don't want anything to do with you, but we finally realised you've got all these good things and we want to keep them. And one of them is the European Medicines Agency. And the question that I asked her is how she would avoid delay in access to new drugs, because brand new drugs are launched in Europe at virtually the same time as America, because it's a market of 500 million people. And it goes through one licensing system, the European Medicines Agency, and then that drug is licensed for the whole of the EEA. Now, what she has come up with is she wants to be an associate member. Sadly, there's no such thing as an associate membership of the European Medicines Agency. And the thing is, Canada and Australia They get new cancer drugs 6 months to a year later than us. So how are we going to avoid that? Why are we throwing away that advantage? And that's not all the European Medicines Agency do. They have particularly directed research into rare diseases, and particularly for children. Now, if you're dealing with rare congenital conditions, in Scotland or even in the UK, you would struggle to have enough young people to study to get an answer. Out of a population of 500 million, with researchers working together right across Europe, we have made more progress in treating rare childhood conditions in the last decade than in multiple decades before. And a lot of that was through the drive of the European Medicines Agency. Now, they also keep up what's called pharmacovigilance, so looking for things that are going wrong with drugs. We're going to be outside that. We're going to be outside other agencies like the European Chemicals Agency. How's that going to work? We're going to not have access to their database. We're also looking at what will happen with drugs at the border. Now, you've heard all the scare stories about no deal, and we might have issues with getting drugs in and out. There will be issues. It will be slower. We will have to support and store more drugs, but where are we going to keep them? So we're expecting pharmaceutical firms to build bigger warehouses. One of the announcements the government made in the summer was pharmacies should increase their storage space. Have you been into your local pharmacy? It looks like my loft. You're asking all of these businesses to suddenly build an extension so that they can stockpile more drugs. Now, the pharmaceutical firms in the UK are increasing that. They're going from either 6 weeks or 10 weeks up to 12 or 14 weeks. Now, if it's just that everything moves a wee bit slower, then that might give us enough of a cushion. If we actually just go right off the cliff with a no deal and we're not moving anything, we're going to run through that pretty darn quickly. And the problem is, it isn't just with a no deal that things will be slow at the border. That will also affect if we end up with Boris's solution, a Canada deal. You're still talking about impact at the border. So we will have issues of supply and flow, and that will happen with any of their chosen outcomes. There's no talk about the fact that the EU is the biggest research network in the world, bigger than China, bigger than America. Now, some of its funding through programs like Horizon 2020, there's been fantastic funding to our universities, to our businesses, to our pharmaceutical industries. But the most important thing is actually the collaboration. The top quality research isn't just one group of researchers in Scotland or one group in the UK. It is literally multi-country, working together right across Europe. And the problem is, a lot of that comes down to the funding, to the administration, to freedom of movement. To be able to ring someone up and say, I can't get that experiment to work. Oh, don't worry, I'll be on Ryanair at 10 o'clock in the morning and we'll get it sorted. Oh, no, I can't. I have to apply for a visa. Freedom of movement allows us to actually work together. And what was completely overlooked in the Brexit debate was that freedom of movement works both ways. It's not just immigrants like my husband coming here. It's the fact that my son did Erasmus in Berlin for a year. It's the fact that many of you may have children or young people in your families who are working across Europe. And suddenly, for the next generation, we're taking that away from them. And the other aspect is the public health. It has often been legislation from Europe that has driven us to clean up our water, to clean up our beaches, to get rid of the acid rain that was burning all our forests. And it was the EU that was threatening to take the UK government to court last year to try and get them to tackle the air pollution, which is killing 40,000 people a year. Now, when I tried to walk to work in London, from about the midway point onwards, I'm just coughing and coughing and coughing because the air is just horrible. And there are children in London with asthma. There are people who are dying because of the pollution. And yet, there's not the interest in fixing it. So there has been this pressure that has come from the EU, which people might go, oh, all the bureaucracy. You look at the proposals that are coming forward from the Conservatives for post-Brexit anything, and then talk about bureaucracy. Like the European Medicines Agency, you had one agency for Europe. this reduced bureaucracy. And what they're talking about to try and patch up their chaos is increased bureaucracy. And then on top of that, obviously in Scotland, we've got a particular problem because Brexit is being used to undermine devolution and 20 years of devolution in our parliament. Now, they won't shut it. There's people who say, oh, they could shut our parliament down. They're not stupid. They would never do anything that overt, but they will hollow it out from the inside. And that's exactly what will happen with the power grab. 24 powers where the ultimate decision level will not come from Europe to here, even though it's over devolved competencies, but will be re-reserved to Westminster. Now people say, well, you never had that power. That power was in Europe. But the drive in Europe is about creating a level playing field. You know, when people say, oh, it's very dry, it's very legalistic, it's to try and avoid any misinterpretation. Everything is written out, everything is translated into 27 languages. Exact wording is something they pay a lot of attention to make sure that the playing field is level. Unfortunately, in the UK, we know the playing field isn't remotely level. And the power grab is about making it even less level. What the Scottish Government was fighting for was accepting that these 24 areas needed some kind of agreement on how are we going to do this. Farming, fishing, subsidy, rural development, etc. We need some kind of framework to agree what we're going to do. But it was that word agree. All the Scottish Government were saying is these should be agreed. But Westminster wouldn't have that. Westminster was determined that they can impose them. And that's the outcome at the moment. And that's what we were promised to debate on 4 times by David Mundell, that we would get to debate and amend their power grab. And when it was going away to the Lords, I pointed out we don't take seats in the Lords. We don't believe in the House of Lords. And unlike the Liberals, who also apparently don't believe in the House of Lords, we actually just don't take seats there. So that meant Scotland's governing party was not going to be represented at the point that they were finally going to lay their amendments to the power grab. But it wasn't just that we would be excluded. No elected member from Scotland of any party would be part of that debate when the government finally laid their amendments to the power grab. Oh, don't you worry, when it comes back to the House of Commons, there'll be plenty of time to debate and amend it. 15 minutes, all of it used by the minister. Not one Scottish MP got to speak about the power grab. Our points of order went on 4 times longer than the debate that night. And then people wonder why we ended up walking out of the Parliament the next day. The power grab is to create an even more unlevel playing field. You have to remember that when you look at these powers, environment, agriculture, fishing, food safety, food standards, food labelling, it's all about selling Scotland to America to get a trade deal. And one of the things that America's really against is geographical indicators. So Scotch beef, Scotch lamb, Scotch whisky. They demand that they will be able to sell American whisky as Scotch. That is one of their absolute prerequisites for a trade deal. But now Westminster controls food labelling. So we have the discussion at the moment, keep Scotland the brand. Well, just watch that disappear over the cliff when this goes forward. Because this will all be about getting a trade deal with Trump. And while I and many others had concerns about TTIP, a Tory-Trump trade deal is way more scary because there'll be no control, there'll be no checks and balances in it whatsoever. And the thing is, for any of these are devolved competencies that we're talking about. So in discussions round the table of the 4 nations, the UK government will be negotiating on behalf of England. But at any point, they can stand up and say, enough already. This is what we're doing, because we're also the UK government. So this is absolutely not a level playing field. I mean, just a wee example, this is not health related, but looking at agriculture. And Michael Gove has said that he thinks there shouldn't be direct subsidies for farmers. They'll support people who are doing extra environmental things, they'll support certain projects, but there shouldn't be direct subsidy of farming. Now that's all right for him to say, because in England, only 17% of the land is classed as less favoured area. In Scotland, it's over 80%. In Wales, it's over 80%. In Northern Ireland, it's over 70%. So you look at that situation, that's fine. They're sitting there thinking, well, we can afford not to subsidise because we're looking at big agri-businesses in the south of England. How are our sheep farmers going to survive that? What's going to happen to our agriculture? And that's what we have to realise, that they will be negotiating what suits England, and they will have the power at any point to say, this is how it's going to be. And that is really concerning. If you're anxious about GM crops, if you're anxious about fracking, if you're anxious about what's going to happen to our NHS in the future. Because one of the powers that I'm very concerned about, and I've been trying to draw attention to, is that hidden way down at the bottom of the list is public procurement. Now, people in Scotland, not everybody supports independence. We're all well aware of that. But the vast majority support devolution. Because most people recognise the benefits they've had. Free childcare, tuition, prescriptions, free personal care for older citizens. And the fact that we still have a united public NHS. Now, the NHS in England has been torn apart because of the Health and Social Care Act. And Section 75 of that Act says that all NHS contracts that can be put out to tender must be put out to tender between the private sector and the NHS. And that's also between the NHS. You've actually got NHS trusts competing with each other, as well as competing with Virgin Care. So this has caused terrible fragmentation. It is no longer a collaborative system. It's a competitive system. And if you talk to nurses and doctors that you know south of the border, they will tell you it is tearing NHS England apart. Now, it is such an issue that when 6 commissioning groups in Surrey tried to bring services back into the NHS, now they weren't breaking a contract with Virgin. The contract was coming to an end, and they just simply realised, actually, we should bring this back in-house. This should be delivered by the NHS. And Virgin sued them. And they sued all 6 CCGs. Now, they won't reveal how much they paid, but one of them paid well over 300,000. So we're talking at least £2 million that went into the pockets of Virgin, because that's their modus operandi. Do you remember when they lost the franchise in the railways? Sue you. That's what they do. So all the UK government have to do is stand up and say, from now on, all public services, all contracts must be put out to tender. They have the ultimate power. Now, we don't know if they're going to want to do that. We might hope they wouldn't. But do we really want that someone else has the power to do that to us? I find that really frightening. And a lot of journalists have not been talking about it because it sounds kind of dry. They know what agriculture and fishing is, public procurement, small print. But it's not. It's one of the most frightening powers that would be taken away from us. So to me, I think it is critical that we start looking at the future that we want, that we recognise from how Scotland has been treated over the last 2 years, the utter contempt that has been shown for Scotland and how we voted, that we start looking at where do we want to go in the future. Because if we were independent, we could protect our parliament. We can decide to be in the EU or the EEA, whatever the decision is. And we can also reject the austerity and poverty politics that is coming out of Westminster and impacting every one of our communities, driving up the number of children growing up in poverty. 1 in 5 people in Scotland are living in poverty. With children, it's 1 in 4. It's a quarter of all of our children growing up in poverty. And yet, Scotland has the lowest poverty rates in the UK. Would you believe that? Now, we know that we've had poverty issues for decades, and yet, of the 4 nations, we have the lowest poverty rates. And that's because the Scottish Government is pouring money in, trying to mitigate the cuts that have been coming to welfare in 2012 and 2016. They're spending 125 million a year on mitigating things like the bedroom tax, in providing the Scottish Welfare Fund for people in crisis. Now, in essence, that's just taking 125 million a year and sending it back down to London, because we're having to mitigate what they're doing to us. If the Scottish Government invest in creating jobs, in helping people get businesses started, the tax from that goes down the road. The job seekers allowance is saved by down the road. It doesn't come back to the Scottish Parliament. You need a virtuous circle to actually change the substance of your country. Because the biggest driver of ill health, and we've talked about Brexit and the power grab, the biggest driver is poverty. Every single condition you talk about is worse in people who are facing deprivation, and in children whose early lives are affected by poverty. They suffer from more mental health. We lose in the UK 1,400 children a year before the age of 15 as a direct result of poverty. That's the equivalent of a secondary school roof collapsing on top of them every single year. As somebody said when I was involved in an inquiry into this, if this was a toxin, it would be banned. And yet we are allowing 1,400 children across the UK to die every year. To die of premature birth, low birth weight, suicide, addiction, car accidents, house fires. All of these things are associated with deprivation. And if we want to change that, if we want Scotland to have a fairer and healthier future, it's going to have to be on our terms. We're not going to get that out of Westminster, where decisions are made because there's people have shares, because people have a financial interest in a certain decision. It's going to have to be that we take control. And that is the call to all of you. We have to get started. I get sick to death of people talking on social media of, we need a date. When's a date? The next campaign won't be 2 years long. Think back. Remember how long it took you to get your group set up? Remember how long it took you to get your first leaflet printed? If you wait for a date, we've missed it. This isn't about when the referendum comes, when we have independence. It's about why. And you have to be getting out and talking to people, whether that's on the doorsteps, your friends at work, your colleagues, your neighbours, your family. And we need to just nudge people gently. You don't need to harangue someone for an hour to try and move them from no to yes in one fell swoop. You're trying to move people one little step along to maybe open their mind to think about, well, I voted no, but actually now you say that, maybe I'll have a wee look at it. That's what we're all trying to do, is to nudge people along that path. Because we are coming to a fork in the road, and it is critical that we make the right decision. So be polite to people. Be gentle. This haranguing folk on Twitter. Yes, you might be having a great time having a slanging match with one person who's talking absolute nonsense. But there's other people who are watching that and think that's how you would speak to them. It achieves nothing. It converts nobody. It's face-to-face discussions that will change people's minds. Talk to people about the thing that's important to them. Do they use the NHS? Are their children at university? Are their children living in Europe? Do they depend on a care worker who comes from Poland? These are the things. Talk to people about what we are approaching, because we are approaching that fork in the road. And we have to recognise that there were people who voted no in 2014 because they thought the status quo was the safe option. It looked like the big, brightly lit motorway, smooth surface, lots of lights. Independence looked like a country road full of trees. I'm just not sure about that. Somebody knocked on my door and told me if I voted yes, I'd get no pension next week. How many of those stories did we hear? So understand why people voted no. It's not all because they are utterly wedded to the United Kingdom. It's because we didn't convince them or we didn't reassure them. We also have to accept there will be people who believe in the United Kingdom the way we believe in an independent Scotland. So you just have to accept that. And there's no point in wasting your energy, there's no point in being rude to people. But people who voted no because they were afraid, these are the people that you have to talk to. Or they voted no because, well, that seemed the obvious decision to take. Because maybe they got bored with it, because they maybe didn't read enough. Because last time there was a status quo. This time there isn't a status quo. It's simply a fork in the road. And down one path is the upheaval and uncertainty of Brexit. And down the other is the uncertainty of independence. Both of them involve big change. But in one, we sign up to be in the boot of Theresa May's car with our finger on our lips, with no voice whatsoever in our future. And in the other one, we climb into the driver's seat and we make the decisions of where we go. Now, we know that Ruth Davidson doesn't want us to have any future independence referendum. That goes without saying. And now this week, Richard Leonard has said exactly the same. So they're clear. They want Scotland to have no choice and no voice. And we need to get to talk to people to get them to realise that it's critical that we have a choice. We cannot be dragged over the Brexit cliff with no input, not just not at the table, but not even in the room. Scotland needs to have a voice, and Scotland absolutely will have a choice. Thank you.